Hey there everybody, this is Chelsea with Let's Talk. Today, let's break down some common confusion between tenses in English. If you haven't already watched our previous video on the construction and characteristics of each tense, now's the time, go back, and we'll see you back here in a minute. So, like I said, in English, usually there's a correct tense to choose. And I'll explain some of those, but occasionally there are two that are acceptable. So we'll start with present tense, okay? Present simple versus present continuous. All right, so present continuous. We use this for an action that is happening right now. So right now I am standing in front of the board. I don't say I stand in front of the board. That's a sentence I could use. I stand in front of the board every day. I stand in front of the board often. But if I want to talk about an action that's occurring, I'll use present continuous. I am standing right now. So remember that there are some verbs that we can't use in a continuous tense. We call those stative verbs. Stative verbs. So for stative verbs, we have to use the simple tense. Stative verbs are things like your senses, like hearing, emotions like love, and verbs like own or have that cannot be used in a continuous form. So those will have to be simple. And if something is just a fact, you're not talking about right now, but just in general, we'll use simple. But when can we use both? When we want to talk about our current situation. Especially with the verbs live and work, though it's true for other ones. I can use either one. I could say, I live in California, or I could say, I'm living in California. These are both totally fine, and they're both really common. You'll hear both of them. With present continuous, there's a little bit of a connotation that maybe it's temporary. It won't last because, right, continuous is happening right now, but it's going to stop eventually. So there's a little bit of that emphasis, but for the most part, they're both fine. I live in California, I'm living in California. I work at a school, I'm working at a school. They're both fine, all right? Next up is present simple versus present perfect. All right, these ones have a very clear divide this time, okay? Simple, we're going to use for stating a fact, and perfect, we're going to use if we want to say how long that fact has been true. So, I have red hair. I have had red hair for my whole life. A really common mistake is for people to use a fact in present tense, simple present, with a length of time. So they would say, I have red hair for 2 years. That's not correct. If we're saying how long the current truth has happened, we need to use present perfect. I have had red hair for 2 years, for 10 years, for my whole life. Okay, let's talk present perfect versus present perfect continuous. of room. Okay, so this is another one where you need to remember that continuous tenses cannot use stative verbs. So if we have a stative verb, we have to use present perfect. And we have to use present perfect continuous when we really want to emphasize how long a current action has been happening. So something that I'm physically doing, something that is physically happening, how long that has been going on. But there are some situations where we can use both. And really, we'll use them both for a situation that started in the past and is still true. So not just an action for perfect continuous, but also a situation. So kind of like our present simple versus present continuous. I can say, I have lived in California for 5 years, or I have been living in California for 5 years. They both describe my life situation. I can use either one. In fact, perfect continuous might be a little bit more common in those examples. I have worked here for 10 years. I have been working here for 10 years. They're both just fine when we're describing your life situation. Okay, past simple versus present perfect. Another one where I see a lot of mistakes with this one, okay? So remember, present perfect is for something that started in the past. And past simple is for something that happened in the past. But for present perfect, that thing is still true. Okay, so if that action, if that activity, that truth is finished, we'll use past simple. If that activity is still going on, if that is still a true statement about yourself, we'll use present perfect. So I can say, I worked there for 5 years. Or, I have worked there for 5 years. When I use past simple, I worked there for 5 years, that means I don't work there anymore. When I say I have worked there for 5 years, that means I'm still working there. That is still a thing that's happening. So if it's finished, use simple. If it's still true, use perfect. Now, there's also, I'll put this down here too. We can kind of use both for repeated actions in the past. So, I could say, let me change that. So both for repeated actions in the past, but there's a little bit of a difference when we use present perfect. So for example, I have eaten there 3 times. I have eaten there 3 times. There's a little bit more of an emphasis that it could happen again. So I have eaten there 3 times and it's so good, I'm definitely going to go back. Compared to past simple for this repeated action, that kind of implies that it won't happen again. All right, so I ate there 3 times, but I found a bone in my meal. I'm never going back. So they both can be used, but there's a little bit more of a tendency for could happen again or it definitely won't happen again between the two. Okay, past simple versus past continuous. Okay, so continuous we'll use for an action that was happening at a specific time. Or an action happening when something else happened. I was performing when the man stood up and yelled. So using that continuous was performing that was occurring when something else happened. That's kind of an interrupting event. Like we've said a few times now, we'll use the simple form for stative verbs, ones that we can't use in a continuous tense. And just like present simple versus present continuous, we can use either one for a situation that was true at the time. So again, like living and working. I was living in New York City. I lived in New York City. They're both fine to describe this situation. Okay, past simple versus past perfect. All right, so past simple, like we said, is just for an event or something that happened in the past. But past perfect is for something that happened before a past simple event. So my previous example was, let's see, I had already performed the song, so I didn't want to do it again. I didn't want to do it is my past simple. Before that feeling, I had already performed it. So 2 things happened. One thing happened before the other one happened. Now, if your sentence has a time word in it, I had bought the tickets before we left. In this sentence, we have this time word before, so we know that this thing happened before this thing. So in this case, we really don't need past perfect. I could just say, I bought the tickets before we left. But in a situation without a time word that's telling us exactly which one happened first, you'll want to use past perfect. All right, last one, I promise. Moving on to the future. Future simple versus future continuous. All right, so continuous. Future continuous is for an action that will be happening at a specific time. or when something else will happen. So I will be performing when your plane arrives. Will be performing, this action is going to be happening, and then when your plane arrives is our comparison there. Like we've said 1,000 times, simple will be used for stative verbs. And both of them can be used for situations. I will be living in Paris. I will live in Paris. They're both pretty much fine. All right, I know that was a lot and that these tenses, sometimes they seem so close. So hopefully this was helpful for you guys, help you keep it straight in your head. This is Chelsea with Let's Talk, reminding you it's not nerdy being wordy. Let's talk again soon.